we're working on marking your essays. We'll get them back to you as soon as possible. I hope it's okay. Right. So we'll do a bit of review. We've been talking about this central question, what is consciousness? And kind of reviewing some of the potential possible scientific answers to the question. We talked about the idea, so for what is it in the ontological sense of what kind of stuff is it made of? We explored the idea briefly that it might be some kind of neural synchrony, some aspect of neural synchrony. We certainly didn't come to some very crisp and clear answer about this, so it was obvious that it's not all neural synchrony. There seems to be neural synchrony that doesn't have conscious correlates, but this is at least some kind of beginning of the answer. At least it looks like a potential research program where you can look into people's brains and see what's happening when they're conscious. That seems like a pretty good start for the question of, like, ontologically, what's the stuff that consciousness is made of? But that's only going to be a satisfying answer if we can answer a whole bunch of other questions about consciousness. Not just what is it made of, but for example, how is it structured? Why have we got the kind of qualia that we've got? This was the problem of, like, why is it that the visual cortex having activity in it has visual qualia associated with it? Why does the auditory cortex have auditory qualia? And I pitched this idea from people like Evan Thompson and other inactivists or embodied cognition people, that it's got something to do with the way that your brain is not just active, but also hooked up to your body, and the way that your body moving through the environment changes the input that you get. So the kind of sensory motor loop that your brain, body, environment are all participating is what helps to give your qualia the kind of character that they've got. This was the tactile visual substitution thing. So we got the what is it, we've got the how is it structured. You know, again, not answers, but like bits of answers, potential research programs at least. We talked a little bit about why we might have consciousness in the first place. What is consciousness for? The function of consciousness. And we looked at the global workspace theory as a potential research program that could tell us a little bit about that. Consciousness is for coordinating the activity of all of your unconscious brain parts into some kind of unified whole, bringing it all together, keeping these parallel unconscious processors aligned in their tasks and sort of all pulling together in some sense. So that might be why we need it. That would be the kind of answer that you would give to, for example, the property dualist who says, oh, you could just have a totally unconscious being that acts just like you, and if this story is right, that's a kind of answer to that person, and you could say to them, no, they wouldn't act just like me because they'd lack this global workspace. We noted about this proposal that it didn't really tell us why it feels like something to be conscious. So that's what we were kind of exploring last time, the idea that Metzinger's self-model theory could give us some kind of, not really an answer even, actually it's more of a rejection of the question or a reformulation of the question of why it feels like something to be me or you. And the story was something like, you've got a transparent self-model. You've got a model of your self-environment and your self-environment relationship, and that model is transparent in the sense that you see through it. You permanently confuse the model with reality itself. You look through your model towards the world and mistake the model for the world itself, for sort of direct conscious access to reality. And that mistake that our brains are constantly making has got some really good benefits for us as evolved beings. You know, you're more engaged in the world. You're not confused about which one of your daydreams is reality. But it's still a mistake. So this is Metzinger's answer to questions about why is it that it feels like something. It's the self-model that you can't help but mistake for reality. And that is that it's transparent. You see through it. And this is a constant systematic error that people make all the time. You mistake the model that you're inhabiting for reality itself. That mistake is why people are so insistent that it feels like something to be them, why it feels like I've got a first-person subjective experience rather than just claiming that there exists some, nobody goes around saying there exists a model of reality in my brain. That's not the claim that people make, but if Metzinger's right, that's the real fact of the matter. The fact of the matter is there's a model of reality in your head. That's what you experience, that model, and the insistence that we've got, this felt surety that our model is something real, is in some sense this failure to make it opaque as a model. And we went through, a lot of the last time was looking at various abnormal self models. In each of those cases, what we can infer is that people are putting their model of reality together in non-standard ways. And in the non-standard case, you can kind of very clearly see the difference between the model and reality. So if somebody's got a phantom limb, they've got a phenomenal model of the limb, but they don't have the limb. So you can tell that they're not directly experiencing the limb, right? That's just obvious. So we looked at a whole bunch of different abnormal self-models where the self-model seems to be doing funny things to kind of bring out, the point of that was mostly to bring out the fact that what people are experiencing is a model rather than direct access to reality. Yeah? Okay. And I talked briefly about this, the idea that the experience of having a first-person perspective, in some sense, it's a real phenomena. It's a real process in your brain. It's certainly not the case that there's nothing there to be explained. So we're not really being eliminativists about consciousness, but we're certainly saying, Metzinger is certainly saying that this is something that we have mistaken ideas about. It's not that it's not there, it's just that we're wrong about what it really is. And then, very briefly at the end, I floated this metaphor, the idea that maybe Metzinger himself was making a mistake. Metzinger says nobody ever was or had a self. Well, that might be like saying that there's no such thing as universities, because yes, there's classrooms and residences and libraries and that kind of thing, but there's no the university. And of course, there are such things as universities. It's just that there's not like some pith or essence of university. There's not like one building that's the university. And just like that, maybe it's not the case that there's one sort of part of your brain or physical thing or process in your mind that is the self. But nonetheless, there's a whole bunch of very real, very important processes of selfhood that you're constantly building, you're constantly constructing, and that we inhabit and that are crucial to our being as humans and all that stuff. So maybe Metzinger's being a little too deflationary about this stuff. Okay. We good on where we're at so far? Like I'm really just sort of tossing a whole bunch, and if you're confused at this point about how all of these things fit together, then you understand it about as well as I do, because I have no idea how to put all these various bits and pieces of research programs together. Yeah? I'm really just offering you the best that I am aware of in terms of the different ways, the different possible inroads that science could have on this question of consciousness at the current moment. Yeah? So I don't have a grand synthesis for you, and I'm certainly not endorsing any of these as the truth, but I do want to endorse these as more than nothing, and interesting, and promising, and things to watch going forward as potential ways of understanding this stuff. Okay. So far, so good. All that stuff. Any questions about any of that stuff? Comments, concerns, deadly criticisms to bring it all crashing down? Okay. Okay. So all of that is not yet to get us to the point where we started from. So when we started this course, we talked about this debate between Descartes and Hobbes, and the idea that Hobbes is saying that we are just kind of machines, we're just kind of meat computers, and that Descartes says, no, how could that possibly be? You can't tell me how you could do all the things that a mind does using a machine. And that a really powerful refutation for Descartes' argument would be to build a full-blown mind, to build something with all of the things that we think are important for minds, like cognition and consciousness, meaning, purpose, all that stuff. So we haven't yet got there. So Metzinger's phenomenal self model, it's got a lot of kind of psychological grounding. It's got a lot of grounding in empirical research, but it's not a program for building a mind. He hasn't yet even started the process of trying to tell us how you would make one of them. So I thought today we would tackle this question, see if there's anything going on in terms of building minds. And here's the best available kind of, as far as I'm concerned, the best available kind of research program going on for this right now. It's the Predictive Processing framework. So almost everything that I'm going to say today comes from stuff from Andy Clark's book, Surfing Uncertainty, and talks he's given and stuff like that. So this is all credit due to Andy. It's a really good book. If this stuff catches your imagination, this is quite readable. He's an excellent writer. It's very, very interesting stuff in my opinion. So predictive processing is a kind of paradigm that might be emerging in cognitive science. That is the overlap between psychology, philosophy, and artificial intelligence. So this project of cognitive science has really been struggling to come up with a paradigm for a long time. So most sciences, most mature sciences have a kind of agreed upon set of assumptions, frameworks, models, that kind of thing. Cognitive science, not so much for most of its history, but this one seems pretty promising. It's the most promising one that I'm aware of right now for putting those projects together, to try to link up philosophy, psychology, and artificial intelligence such that you can build these things. So the predictive processing framework comes with a really robust artificial intelligence component so that we can build machines that can do a number of these things. Just to foreshadow and just to sort of dampen expectations a little bit, they're still not super clear on how the consciousness aspect works. So they're more focused on perception and trying to understand how perception works. But maybe we can sort of vaguely imagine how the global workspace theory or Metzinger's phenomenal self model theory might fill in that gap in this discussion. So maybe this predictive processing stuff gives us the mechanism that could realize something like a phenomenal self model or something like a global workspace. Again, very speculative. I'm not saying this is for sure the answer, but maybe. Let's call it a strong maybe. Okay. So what is this thing? The essential idea of the predictive processing model is that your brain is fundamentally a prediction engine. That's what your brain really is all about. It's making all kinds of predictions all the time. And its goal is to anticipate the input that it's likely to get next. Yeah? It's trying to guess what's about to come at it, or to try to predict and what's happening right around it right now. And then it generates a bunch of predictions. So it's got models at various levels of what's going on in its environment, the causes behind those goings on, and those models are constantly generating predictions, sort of real time, online, generating predictions. And then what perception does is basically just provide an error signal for those predictions. So your brain is generating all of these predictions about what it thinks it's likely to see, and perception really just acts as a kind of check on whether its predictions are working or not. Yeah? It's an error signal, and when the predictions don't match the perceptions, then the models get adjusted. And what your brain is doing is generating all these models. If it gets it right, it keeps using those models as they are. If it gets it wrong, then it adjusts the models until it gets a good, clear prediction that tracks to reality. Yeah?
Doesn't that seem similar to a neural net?
Yes, so a lot of the predictive processing is using neural networks. Yeah. But we'll see that it's got a kind of, there's a certain class of neural networks that they're using. Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, so the brain as a predictive engine doesn't really fit with a traditional way of thinking about how perception works. So here's I just Googled, visual system V1, V2, V3, and Okay, so what you get are pictures like this. So this is V1. So your eyeball, for probably weird reasons, your eyeballs are over here. Your visual processing starts at the back of the brain, which seems inefficient, but whatever. This starts at V1. So V1's taking in the kind of raw data, yeah? And then the raw data is fed forward to more abstract things. So you got a bunch of raw visual information, and then V2 parses it into objects, and then V4 parses it into more abstract, high-level descriptions and stuff like that. And the very standard way that this is presented is as a feed-forward process. Information comes in through your senses and then goes to higher processing, goes to the conceptual system. Now, that undoubtedly happens, right? It's clear that there's information going in through your eyeballs and that it's moving in this direction through the brain. But there's just as many connections from from V4 back to V2 and from V2 back to V1 as there are from V1 forward. So in general, this is the wiring diagram of the brain. If there's a connection from V1 to V2, there's going to be a connection from V2 back to V1 as well. We typically don't represent it that way. We typically think of information processing in the brain as a kind of passive process. So your sense organs are just out there in the world, soaking in information, and the information goes towards higher cognitive process in the sense of recognizing the objects, categorizing them, placing them in an abstract space, and thinking about them, right? So the picture of passive perception is kind of what the predictive processing model is going to flip on its head. In some sense, they want to turn perception upside down, at least in terms of emphasis. What they think is that your experience is mostly or even entirely, depending on which predictive processing person you ask, constituted by your predictions. It's constituted by those predictions. What you experience is not what's coming in through your sense organs. Your sense organs are really just modulating the signal that's generated by your predictive models. That's the kind of quite counterintuitive but somewhat exciting proposal from predictive processing. Yeah? And then those predictions are, as I said, kind of just modulated, modified, fine-tuned by your sense experiences. Yeah? So there's more or less extreme versions of this. There are some people that think your perception is constituted by the combination of incoming information and predictions. They somehow join together to constitute your sense experience. But there's other people that think that no, your sense experience just is the predictions. So it's your model that you're experiencing, not your sense experience. Neat, right? Okay. So we can break this down into two main ideas. When Andy Clark presents this, he says he would bet huge amounts of money on one being true, the idea that your brain has a whole bunch of predictive generative models. That is the idea that we generate predictions about what sort of information we're likely to receive. That part seems to be pretty well established. So I'll talk a bit about this, and then we'll move on to talking about predictive coding. This is the more controversial bit. This is the bit that's sort of counterintuitive. The idea that the only thing that gets processed by higher cognition is the prediction errors. So that your sense organs don't get to talk to more abstract parts of your brain unless there's a prediction error. If all of your predictions are satisfied, your sense data doesn't influence your higher cognitive processes at all. Now, all that gets passed up this kind of hierarchy of processing are the errors. So that's the predictive coding. So again, one seems to be very well grounded in empirical. I mean, this can all be turned out to be wrong, but like one seems to be a really good bet. Two is a bit more controversial, but both of these are part of the kind of overall predictive processing framework. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about generative models. Right. Okay, so remember when we talked about connectionism, we talked about these neural networks, connectionist networks. The ones that we talked about, they're pretty simple and straightforward. They're what's called discriminative. Discriminative. They discriminate. That is, what they do is they take in some data. So in this input layer here, they take in some data, and then they pass it through the hidden layers, and then there's an output layer. The data is something like an image that you fed it, and the output layer is something like, so if you're feeding it like handwriting or something like this, you give it one letter, and it makes its output is a guess about which letter that is. So it's categorizing things. Yeah, you give it some input, and then you categorize it. The output is the category that it thinks that this thing is a member of. You train these things up by giving them some data and then telling it how close it got to the answer. So you have labeled data. You know what the category is supposed to be. That's a B. So it says it's an R, and you say not quite. Try again, and then you keep going and going, training it up until it's successfully able to discriminate what kinds of data belong to which categories. So that's a discriminative model. It's doing a categorization task. The generative model goes in the opposite direction. So suppose you've got this thing all trained up to recognize what a bee looks like. If you build it right, you can run it in the other direction and say, tell me something that you think would look like a bee. Generate a bee for me. And so it goes this way and generates some data for itself. Yeah, that's a generative model. It produces data. It doesn't just categorize data. And you can kind of run these things backwards or forwards. So you can use data to train it up as a discriminative model and then run it backwards to use it as a generative model. So it produces its own data. So is the difference between a generative and a discriminative model fairly clear? One of them takes in data and produces a category. One of them, you tell it what category of thing to make, and it produces data. Yeah? So this is like predicting what it's likely to see. So you say to it, tell me what you're likely to see. If you're seeing a bee, what do you think that would look like? Or if you think you're seeing a cat, what do you think a cat looks like? Yeah? And it'll generate an image. Okay, so this version of a neural network is kind of the 1980s version, back when they could barely recognize typed letters, never mind handwriting. The kind of neural networks that we use today are almost always based on something like this. They're kind of multi-level, and they operate on in terms of what's called the wake-sleep algorithm. It's developed in the early 90s by a guy called Jeff Hinton and his collaborators. And it's a kind of cycle of generative and discriminative phases. Okay, so here's what you do. If you want to train up one of these things. So each of these layers, H1, H2, H3, each of those is a neural network. Okay? Each of them is capable of taking in data. Each of them is capable of generating data. So at the very bottom level, you give it some images, and then H1 does its best attempt at categorizing those images. And then H1 sends its judgments of the categorization to H2, which then does the same for H3. So this might be the layers of determining, like, I think that is a flat surface, and I think that is a vertical surface. And then H2 says, I think that's a tabletop, and I think that's a leg. And then H3 says, I think that's a table. Yeah, so we're getting to more and more abstract features of the thing that's being categorized. Okay, so that's the wake cycle, taking in, just like when you're awake, you take in information, and you try to extract general features of that information. And then you do the sleep cycle. In the sleep cycle, and Hinton says, this sounds like it shouldn't work. If this sounds like it shouldn't work, then you agree with the person who invented this, because he says, this sounds like it shouldn't work at all, but it does. So once you've trained this up with some data, you then get H3 to generate guesses about what kind of data it thinks it's likely to see. And it passes that to H2, which then takes that in as input and then generates as sort of like so I think this looks like a table. okay, what do you think what do you think tables look like? And H2 says, well, I think they've usually got legs and a top, and then passes that to H1, and you say, what does a tabletop usually look like? Oh, I think it's usually flat, and it's kind of got gaudy faux wood paneling on it or something like that. And then H1 passes that out to an image of what it thinks a table looks like. Yeah?
So is it like a loop?
That's right.
Itself, like, reaches its own stream?
So it's a loop. It's very much a loop. So you use real data to train it in the wake cycle, and then it generates its own data in the sleep cycle, which then gets fed back into a wake cycle. So it's passing information back and forth, up and down this hierarchy. Now, why this works is because old school neural networks had a really bad habit of over-fixating on some details, right? They would overfit to the data. If you've done some stats, you know this overfitting is when you lock in on some specific features of the data and think that those are the important features. This system does this thing where it's narrowing down the possibilities in the wake cycle and then opening them back up in the sleep cycle. So it's you're kind of letting this neural network play a little bit. Unhooked up, unmoored by actual data, the neural network plays around with itself in some sense. It's generating its own guesses about what it's likely to see, and then testing itself on those guesses, generating some more guesses, and testing itself. Yeah?
So this is like a kind of an idea of machine learning then?
Yeah, so this is all machine. The old school stuff was machine learning too, but this is deep learning, something like this. If you heard deep learning, this is the kind of algorithm that they use. And if you use this kind of architecture, the generalizations that they produce are much better than the generalizations for old school neural networks that were just discriminative. So if you let it go through these cycles of discrimination and generation, it's a much better categorizer at the end. Sounds like it shouldn't work, right? That sounds bizarre. But most of the advanced machine learning that we have today is based on something like this cycle. Cycles of generation, discrimination, and then generation, discrimination, and then generation. Yeah? This is also, by the way, generated a really nice hypothesis about what dreams are for. So if your brain is acting like this, you take in a bunch of information from the day, you try to extract the generalities from it. You try to extract what's invariant in that data, but you're in danger of overfitting that data. Yeah? You don't want that. You want your grasp on the data to be not so particular, not fixed on the details. So maybe, this is just a hypothesis, but maybe what dreams are for is allowing your brain to open up the possibilities a little more. So it's doing this narrowing down the possibilities, and in the sleep cycle, when you're dreaming, it's opening them back up again so that you don't get overfitted to the data that you're experiencing. I don't know. So it's a very interesting thought that comes out of, they just built this thing to do machine, they didn't do this as a psychological study. This was just to be a better machine learner, but it generated that kind of interesting hypothesis. Okay, so that's the very idea. So, when it's starting off, the early guesses, you give it a bunch of data, you give it a bunch of triangles, its early guesses are pretty bad, right? The kind of generative, the information that it generates don't really resemble the data that you're looking for all that much. But if you put it through a number of these cycles and you feed it with a bunch of good data, it eventually does get really good at generating what it thinks the kind of data it will see will look like. So data constrains the network during the cycle. It constrains it down to a few possibilities. And then the guesses open those possibilities back up, but in a way that's guided by the data. It's not just randomly doing stuff. Just like your dreams are not just random colors and sounds and feelings, right? Your dreams bear some relationship to your life. So they're not unconstrained by reality, but they're not tightly constrained by reality. It's like your brain is allowing itself to play around a little, to self-organize, you might say. So this is the predictive processing people and the wake-sleep algorithms is supposed to be an example of what happens when you allow machines to self-organize. Turns out they're much more robustly able to track generalities in the data. No? Okay. So, like, this is the, and again, this is the bit that Andy Clark is really certain about. Humans do seem to have predictive generative models working on us. So that wake-sleep cycle was one particular way of using these generative models. But just the very idea that we've got generative models going in us seems to be really well supported by a whole bunch of psychological evidence. So the fact is that you experience things very differently if you expect those things than if you don't expect them. The expected hits you very differently than the unexpected. Think, for example, if you're listening to your favorite song and then one note's missing. Yeah? It will shout out at you, right? That missing note will be loud. The silence will be loud to you because you've heard the song a million times and now it's missing that one bit. It'll be disturbing and shocking because you very much predicted that it would be there and now you're getting this error signal. Okay, so just as an example of predictive generative or predictive models, think about object permanence. This is one of the earliest predictive models that you had to establish. So when kids are before 4 or 5 months, the peekaboo game is super fun for them, right? Mom hides her face, she's back. It's because the kid does not have the predictive model that says when mom's hiding her face, she's still there, right? Coming back is a surprise. They're shocked and surprised. They're delighted with surprise every time. They get a little tense. Oh no, mom's gone. Oh, she's back, hooray. Because they can't generate the prediction that she's still there when her hands are covering her face. So this model seems to develop slowly. It develops across a couple of phases. So after 4 or 5 months, infants can respond to objects that they can't see. So if you put an object in front of the infant and shut off the lights, they can still grasp for it, right? They've got the idea that it still might be there, right? But they're not able to do, for example, the idea that the eraser is still there when it's behind something. So when I do this, the baby is surprised and delighted when it comes out from behind the... But after 4 and 5 months, they're not surprised and delighted anymore. They track this by how long and hard the baby looks at something. It's hard to ask the babies what they think about the world, but you can measure their gaze, and the consensus is the longer the baby looks at something, the more surprised they are. So after 5 months, this gets no extra gaze. They're like, yep, I knew it was back there. But they don't yet have the idea that an object can be, for example, in a drawer or under a box, or if you put like a blanket over it. They haven't yet got that it's, so they have behind, but they don't yet have inside. So if you put something in a box and then pull it back out again, the 5-month-old will still be surprised and delighted. Yeah? So the kind of predictions that they're able to make seems to go through these kind of paradigm shifts at reasonably regular, I mean, everyone's different, but seems to go on average through a few paradigm shifts. So they're able to get first, I can't see it, but maybe it's still there. Then they get, it's behind a thing, but it's still there. Then they get, it's under a thing or inside a thing, but it's still there. Now, I take it that for all of us, that predictive model is fairly robust at this point in our lives, yeah? The idea that the object is still there when you're not looking at it, there's no more surprise or delight in that as a prediction, right? Yes, okay. So we've got this really robust predictive model that when the eraser goes behind the screen, it still exists, it's still in my hand and that kind of thing, yeah? So that's a predictive model that you've got. You don't notice it because you're so good at it, but you're nonetheless making this kind of prediction all the time, all the time. Okay. I forgot to set this up. So here's a fun little example of predictive models of sound. Boy, I really should have set this up beforehand. Okay. All right. Let's see if I can do this. So, all right. Just one moment, please. If you can see, I'm recording this lecture because they were supposed to come observe my teaching, but nobody had time. So I'm going to cut this out so it seems like I'm really slick and prepared. Okay. 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 So, this is the Vimeo of Leo Nordwall. I don't know who this guy is. Okay, so what's going to happen is there's going to be a kind of hard to understand distorted sound, and then you're going to hear it of language, and then you're going to hear it clearly once so you know what they're saying, and then the first sound is going to be played again. And I'm going to bet that it'll sound different the second time. So once you know what they're saying, you'll hear the exact, I promise this, one thing and then a clear version and the exact same thing over again. Yeah? So see if having the ability to predict what sound you're about to hear makes any difference to the way that you perceive it. Let me just, is that loud enough? All right. I think that's all we're going to get. All right. Okay.
It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park. It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park. It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
It's different the second time, right? There's a couple more.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo. The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo. The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo. He was sitting at his desk in his office. He was sitting at his desk in his office. He was sitting at his desk in his office. The police returned to the museum. The police returned to the museum. The police returned to the museum.
Weird, right? That's weird, right? And I promise you it was the same every time. So, I take it that that's a kind of evidence that you're not just raw taking in sense data. Yeah? You're not just taking in sense data and then interpreting it. What you're doing is meeting the sense data that you're reading, you're experiencing with predictions. And if you know what's coming, you're much more able to parse what you're taking in. Yeah? Okay. Okay. So, let's switch now. So that was the generative models bit. Let's switch now to the more controversial bit, which is the predictive coding bit of this. So this is the idea that so again, just like the wake-sleep algorithm, you're supposed to have a kind of hierarchy of predictive models. So you get very low-level predictive models, like I expect to see shapes in front of me. I expect to see the low-level details, and that those get assembled into higher-level details. And then higher-level details, like when I expect, for example, you to all be the same people when I turn my head and turn back. So like the stability of your basic identities is a higher-level prediction that my brain is making. And the predictive coding suggestion is that the only thing that gets passed up the hierarchy are the errors. The only thing that makes it up are the differences between predictions and experience. Yeah? That's fairly controversial, but it's at least a thing that we can entertain as a possibility. The slogan here is, perception is controlled hallucination. We are vividly hallucinating at the world, as Thomas Metzinger sometimes says. So your experience of the world is ultimately just on this model. It's not a figment of your imagination, but it is generated from within and then just fine-tuned by reality, assuming that you're not on weird drugs or something, right? So on the case where you're sober, your hallucination is just highly constrained by the sense data that you're taking in, but it is nonetheless a product from within, as it were. Yeah. So the real content of your senses are the guesses generated by your generative predictive models. So these generative models are pumping out guesses at various levels about what you're likely to experience, and that's what you're experiencing, just these guesses. And you can see how that's modeled. So the relationship between this and the AI research is we're getting pretty good at building generative models, at hierarchically nested generative models, and they seem to do a pretty good job of doing the kind of discrimination tasks that we're interested in. So, we're getting there. Here's a fun experiment, the White Christmas experiments. So I'll just read this to you. 44 undergraduate students were asked to listen to white noise, that is just random static. They played a clip of some random static, and they were instructed to press a button when they believed hearing a recording of Bing Crosby's White Christmas without this recording actually being presented. So they told them they're about to hear White Christmas, they just played them some static, and 32% of these people pressed the button at some point so they heard White Christmas because they expected to hear White Christmas. They were able to take this random information and discriminate a pattern in it because they had the prediction that they'd find it. Yeah. And that seemed to correlate reasonably well with the Londy-Slade hallucination scale. So if you're prone to hallucinations elsewhere in your life, those kind of people were more likely to have pressed the button. And there's a wide spectrum of degree to which you're prone to hallucination. And it might have, some of the interesting research that's coming out of the predictive processing framework is trying to understand various non-standard mental states in terms of the kind of predictions that you're willing or able to make. So, for example, schizophrenia is not listed as schizophrenia in the DSM anymore. It's salience dysregulation disorder. Yeah? So it's when you're hearing voices or you're seeing faces or whatever, what you're doing is finding patterns where maybe you shouldn't be finding patterns. Don't want to be too normative about it, but I prefer to not have that be my life. So it's being too willing to find patterns in the environment. Yeah? You can do this to regular people too by just making them, so people become, to the degree that people feel that they aren't in control of their situation and that they're vulnerable, they're more prone to, for example, superstitions. So they will find patterns in their environment that aren't necessarily there. So, yeah.
Is there a bias to the experiment? Like, did they get the song presented to them ahead of time, or are they just expected to know it? Because how can you hallucinate a song if you've never heard the song?
I think the assumption is that everybody's heard White Christmas, because we've all been to malls in December. So,
you have to hear it again to know what it is.
I looked at this last night, but I don't recall whether they presented the song to them beforehand or not. Would that be a bias?
It could, because hearing the song ahead of time could prime your brain to make you think you're going to hear it.
So they definitely primed them by saying, we're going to play White Christmas for you, just wait for it. So they definitely did prime them. If that's okay, so if you never heard the song, then I think you're kind of out of the experiment.
Then what would that knock the number of participants down to then?
I don't know, but I don't understand why this is a problem for the experiment.
Because if, say, the 14 participants that pushed the buttons knew the song, and the remaining ones didn't, then that's not indicative of actually hallucinating.
Oh, that would make it much higher. That would make this number much higher. If the remaining people who didn't press it just never heard White Christmas or can't remember what it sounds like, that would mean that many more people are having this hallucinatory experience than actually did. So the shocking and exciting result of this is supposed to be how many people thought they heard White Christmas when they were hearing no such thing. The fact that you can make 32% of undergraduates hallucinate just by suggesting something to them actually seems to be a shocking result to me. And if that number is much higher than it actually is, I think that makes it more shocking and more interesting. It's at least better evidence for the predictive processing framework than has been presented here, yeah? In some, priming was definitely necessary, and it's certainly the assumption is that they know what the song sounds like. Yeah? Yeah.
And it also makes sense to me in this experiment that they would only be exposed to something that they knew. Therefore, your brain can only make predictions and on things that you already know.
That's right. That's right. So you can only, your predictions are really based on the regularities in your environment being stable and you having a pattern for it. One time at a birthday party, they handed around what they described as cake pops. So it's like a little chocolate lollipop. And they're like, okay, don't bite into it yet. We're going to get a video of it. And we all sang happy birthday, and we all bit into it. And inside was a Brussels sprout, not a cake. And it took me, it was a fascinating 4 or 5 seconds while my brain couldn't believe what my mouth was telling it. I had no idea that you could put a Brussels sprout in a lollipop form that was covered in chocolate, and it was just like a Brussels sprout. And I couldn't parse what was happening. I had no predictive model that matched what was going on until you look at it and that's a Brussels sprout. So yeah, if there's a big gap between what you can possibly expect and what's going on in the world, you can have these it was a very weird moment. Anyway, yeah. Oh, sorry, please settle down.
Just like what you said, this reminded me of this video I saw of this guy that got
Please settle down. Yeah, that's good.
like a candy apple, but it wasn't actually candy apple, it was an onion.
Yeah.
And it took him a couple bites.
Yeah. Yeah.
Realized it was an onion, not an apple.
Yep.
But it just reminded me
It's exactly the same phenomenon. There's a scene in the original Ghostbusters where a demon runs by Rick Moranis, and Rick Moranis runs out going, "It's a bear," because he doesn't have a category. It was such a low probability prediction that a big scary demon would run through your condo. A bear was the only thing that he could perceive it as. So we perceive the world in the ways that we have kind of mental categories for. Part of the consequences of the predictive coding framework is that all of your mental experiences are at least weakly conceptualized. So because what you're experiencing are these predictions, you have to have a category for those predictions. At least something. It can be a weak category, but you have to have a category ready to go. Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
There's another experiment that's kind of like this. Well, it's not really an experiment, but surfaced on the internet.
Yep.
You heard this weird noise, and there's a list of words. Whatever word you read is whatever word you heard.
Yep. Yep.
So does that fit into?
I think that fits very nicely. Yeah. So what you do is you prime, and probably the sound was ambiguous between a bunch of different words. And what you did was just like with the sounds we just heard, you apply the sound that you're expecting to hear to the data, and you find it in the data. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's what makes the coding part of this interesting, is that the error code almost makes sense.
Yeah.
Because it's just like your brain would be looking for the part of the Brussels sprout that you didn't expect.
That's right. I'm like, what? I'm trying to categorize it as a type of cake, and Brussels sprout wasn't one of my guesses. So it's very, one of the criticisms of this is how conceptual and representational it is. So some people think that the brain is not ultimately dealing in representations, in categories and concepts. And their critique of this sort of stuff is that it makes everything that you experience kind of within a concept. And that might be one reason to think that it's not just the error signals. Yeah. Yeah.
The video that he was talking about, I saw that was the green needle and brainstorm. And it's I don't know what it is, a kid's toy or something that it says something, I don't know what it says, but it asks do you hear green needle or brainstorm? And you can actually hear both, I don't know.
Right,
hear
if
both,
you
but
can
it's
flip
not,
it.
what you're thinking about.
Yep. Neat.
Video, though.
Neat. Yeah.
Yeah, does it bunch of those online where you can just you can hear one thing or the other. I feel like the blue and black dress, white and gold dress was one of these things.
Oh, yeah.
Sort of, yeah.
Like 3 years ago on.
Yeah.
But also,
Yeah.
What about
Yeah.
the duck?
Oh,
rabbit?
the duck rabbit. Yeah, the duck rabbit.
Is it the same thing?
So that's a kind of, okay, so it's in some sense the same thing, that's from the Gestalt psychology tradition. So what your brain is basically looking for, the Gestalt psychologists say, is meaningful wholes, meaningful integrated information that you can put together into some kind of package that has significance for you. So with the duck rabbit, they didn't, if you prime them probably, if you say, here's a picture of a duck, you'll probably see the duck, right? Because you already have the meaning that you're expecting. Now with the duck rabbit, the point is more just that people can see it differently. So they didn't typically prime them one way or the other. They just show you that you can generate two meaningful wholes out of the same information. Yeah? So that's an earlier prediction of the Gestalt psychologist that just says your brain's looking for meaningful wholes. The predictive encoding framework is making an additional claim on top of that it's making predictions about which meaningful wholes you're likely to experience, rather than just sort of seeing some data and giving a meaningful interpretation. Okay. So I'm just going to keep going if you don't mind. I don't have another whole hour to go, so we'll just blast through, yeah? Okay, so the Clark's argument is that this actually fits really nicely with the embodied cognition stuff. So one of the critiques is that one of the possible critiques you can make of this stuff is it makes cognition seem really in your head, really conceptual. And Clark's response is that it's actually fits pretty nicely with the embodied perspective, because one of the streams of information that you're using to make your predictions, to shape the models that you're building predictions about, is interior bodily information. So here's a fun little paper on why do you fear the boogeyman, an embodied predictive coding model of perceptual inference. So here it is. I'll read this to you. Okay, it's a windy night. You go to sleep a bit shocked because, say, you had a small car accident or just watched a shark attack horror movie. Weird examples, but anyway. During the night, you hear a window squeaking. In normal conditions, you would attribute this noise to a windy night. But this night, the idea that a thief or even a killer is entering your house jumps into your mind. Normally, you would have immediately dismissed this hypothesis, but now it seems quite disbelievable, despite the fact that there have been no thefts in your town in the last few years. Suddenly, you find yourself expecting a thief to come out of the shadows. How is this possible? And they think that the combination of predictive coding and the embodied perspective gives us some information, gives us a really good story about why you might think this. So you hear a creaking window, and your adrenaline and your cortisol are up, your heart rate is up, your muscles are a bit tense. So your body's telling you there's danger around because you just watched apparently a shark attack movie. And your senses are telling you there's a window creaking. So the combination of those two, what's dangerous and causes windows to creak? Somebody's sneaking in. So your brain is putting those two streams of information, one of them auditory and one of them embodied, together into a meaningful whole. Yeah.
So could this serve as the foundation for PTSD? If that's in predictive processing?
I think so. I think so. So, did you have more to?
Oh, I have.
Okay, yeah. So, potentially, I can't spin you an elaborate story about how that would work right now. But that is the kind of thing. So that's the kind of thing that they are hoping that the predictive coding structure can give you. So yeah. So if your body is permanently stuck on, okay. So this is a bad habit for philosophers to be in when we wade into psychology. We're just like, I can make something up about that. Okay. Okay. So here's a story that you might tell. So your body is permanently stuck on there's danger around, and then you hear a loud noise. And if your body's not permanently stuck on there's danger around, so suppose you got PTSD from being in a combat situation, your body's telling you, oh my God, there's danger. Your auditory system says there's a loud noise. What's a dangerous loud noise? Well, that's somebody shooting at you. So you hear a loud noise and like, oh my God, I'm under fire. And that's a very it's a very meaningful whole that you can put together. So if you can come up, if there's a kind of physiological, like stuck on fight or flight in the body, and then all of your interpretations of your environment are going to be quite reasonably integrated with that internally generated bodily signal, and the probability that there's real danger around you will seem much larger than if your body wasn't permanently on fight or flight. There, I made up a theory. That was great. This is very bad practice. So that was pure speculation, but this is the appeal of this paradigm, is that they are hoping that you can come up with and then actually test scientifically theories like that. Yeah.
Can I just add to that speculation with more speculation?
Why not? Why not?
Why not? Here's evidence. It's sort of like somatic experience.
Oh, psychosomatic, yeah.
So this is really cool. So it's PTSD, and I am a philosophy student, so you guys can shoot down whatever I'm saying. But reptile brain, there's a process, a defense mechanism that isn't completed, sort of, that causes PTSD. So that the part of your body that would react and try to defend itself, it's unable to. So that process isn't completed. That's one theory of PTSD. Again, that is the extent of my knowledge. But with somatic experience, it's the idea where if you can try to access that part of your brain and get the person to carry out that experience, so they relax and then they just do whatever, they get into this sort of mindfulness state where they allow their body to complete that experience. The person who created this uses the example, he was hit by a car,
right.
And as he turned to try to move his arm to defend himself, he couldn't, so he hit. And then he learned that if he completed that experience enough, it actually solved his PTSD. So he started doing this with people, and they do that.
Yep.
Anyway, I'm ranting, but it's so interesting.
That's really cool.
Because it certainly seems that if you can get out of that mind state, you won't I have to believe it to see it anyway.
So again, this is your hypotheses. This is a possible research program. These are not answers. These are things that we could research scientifically and actually test. But this seems like a pretty good, what a paradigm's supposed to do for you is generate hypotheses that are worth testing, potentially worthwhile. So if it's doing that, then it's doing its job as a paradigm. Yeah?
There is an answer to this problem in cognitive psychology where if there, well, I don't know if it's really cognitive psychology, but certain frequencies, like magnetic frequencies, can cause hallucinations.
Yep.
So it's possible that like even an alarm clock can cause someone to have to experience the supernatural.
Sorry.
Cognitive prof told me this.
What in this was supernatural?
So like feeling that there's like a thief about to come out of the shadows. So like the frequency from the alarm clock that might be by your bed can cause you to think in that sort of way.
Okay, that's one potential story. Yeah. Okay.
It's weird.
That is very odd. That is very odd. Yeah, so that's another thing that could cause you. So what they were telling us here was just one story about why we might have the experience of danger when there's maybe none. There might be other causes for sure. Yeah. Okay. Right. So here's another nice example of embodiment and prediction. So as it turns out, if you ask outfielders, professional baseball players, to stand still and predict where a ball is going to fall, they're bad at it. And you'd think that they would be really good at it. That's their job, right? You're an outfielder. Your whole job is to be under the ball, right? So predicting where the ball is supposed to be, that seems like you should just knock it out of the park, but that's the opposite. So why? They're very good at predicting where the ball is going to be if they're allowed to move. Of course, again, they're paid millions of dollars sometimes to be good at this specific task of predicting where the ball is going to be if they're allowed to run around. So one of the thoughts here is, so here's a really good strategy. If you're trying to catch a ball that's coming at you, here's a really good strategy. Move such that the ball is stationary in your visual field. So if it's if it's going to come land in front of you, you run, you can see it dropping, so you run towards it, and it stays stationary. You'll be under it. Yeah? So what you're doing there is using your bodily engagement with the world to generate the right kind of information to make cheap and easy predictions. Yeah? When you're running such that the ball stays, so it's moving towards you, and you don't want it to be going up, you don't want it to be going down, you want it to stay fixed in your visual field, and then if you can do that, you're using your body to alter the information stream that's coming in to make the prediction very, very easy. Whereas it's very, very, again, these are if there's anybody who's an expert at predicting where a ball is going to land in an outfield, it's these guys, and they're bad at it if you don't let them run around. So the idea is that one of the ways that we generate the right kind of information to feed to our predictive models is by moving through our environment, interacting with it, that kind of thing. Yeah? And you can kind of see babies doing this too. So you can see babies interacting with their environment in a way that will generate lots of rich information that's useful to them to build their predictive models, mostly by smashing things and throwing things. Destructively testing their environment in a way that gives them a rich source of information for figuring out how things work. Yeah? That's why they're always throwing things. That's why they're trying to break things. That's why they're trying to put things in their mouth. Right? They're manipulating their environment in a way to feed themselves lots of rich, useful information at a kind of relatively low-cost way to build high-quality predictive models, to get the right kind of data stream to make your predictive models do what they're supposed to do. Yeah? So the basic thought is that this goes pretty nicely. So the argument is this goes nicely with the embodied perspective on conscious experience that we saw a little while ago. So if the argument is your conscious experience is largely structured by the way that we're embodied and the way that our body generates information for us in these sensory motor loops, the predictive coding people think that they can nicely integrate that into their picture. Yeah? Good. Okay. So, as I said, as I've been emphasizing, this is a fairly controversial idea. The predictive coding part of it is pretty controversial. The idea that there's just the error signals being fed up, not the data that's coming in. There are different ways of using very similar architecture where some of the data does get fed forward, yeah? Or get fed up the chain. So the debate is between the sort of pure predictive coding people and more, I guess they sometimes talk about the Bayesian brain, where some of this information goes up. There are also models when you can, for example, tune how much information, how much of it is just error signal and how much of it is data. That kind of, so in some contexts, maybe you only care about the error signal, but in other contexts, maybe you care about the data, something like that. Yeah?
Seems like we're kind of like blending that idea of the relevance that we talked about earlier. Like
Right.
how do we get relevance into this whole system?
That's a big, I mean, I've been trying to think about that, and I don't know if they have a good answer to that actually. Even if they have this tuning thing, because like, so yeah, I think for my money, that's one of the serious questions that this whole thing has to deal with. Because when we talked about relevance, we're like, well, you can't make all of the deductions and then figure out which ones are relevant afterwards. Similarly here, it strikes me that you can't make all of the predictions and then figure out which ones are relevant afterwards. You need to know which are the relevant predictions to make, which are the relevant models to generate, and how active should any one of them be at a given time. And they don't seem to have a very clear story about that. So they don't have a very clear story about how, for example, motivation fits into this. They don't have a very clear story about how goals fits into this. What they've got is a really, really good story about how we, like perception gets turned into categorization, gets turned into causal models, gets turned into a picture of the world. but not so much about how we decide which aspects of the practically infinite aspects of the world that we could be modeling. How do we pick out the ones that are important? So, yeah.
And that almost feels like it could emerge into the consciousness theories.
Right.
That's where consciousness kind of moves.
Right.
So.
Excellent. Excellent. So yeah, so the stories that we've been talking about global workspace or the phenomenal self model, maybe they've got something to say, something to add to that picture of just raw perception, where we're not just perceiving, we are consciously perceiving, and maybe consciousness is a kind of relevance filter. Great, we solved it. You guys, we solved the mind. Woo! All right. Okay. Not really. Okay. I don't know. Okay, so so that's the basic idea. Predictive generative models, those are really, really good. Those are really the basis for a lot of the modern artificial intelligence. Predictive coding, it's a kind of relatively controversial thesis, but hopefully it's a fruitful way of testing a bunch of hypotheses. There you go. That's all I got to say about consciousness. So next time we're really just going to review and overview and all that stuff. Okay, thanks everyone.